Opening day is fast approaching. The Giants have a lot of out-of-options players. How many of them are going to make it onto the opening day roster, particularly given that rosters are going to expand to 28 for the first few weeks of the season? So we'll talk about that and a lot of other questions on today's Mailbag Locked On Giants.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily San Francisco Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Giants, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Kaspick, and on this show we provide daily episodes Monday through Friday talking about the San Francisco Giants in a way that's data-driven and rational, but also simple, passionate, and accessible to all. I'm a former contributor for the baseball statistics and analysis websites Beyond the Box Score and Rotographs. I've been podcasting about the Giants since 2015, and I'm a lifelong fan. Thanks for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get podcasts. And coming up on today's show, we're gonna kind of mix and match a few things. I want to get to some mailbag questions and also tie it in with some news. For example, the Giants made a minor trade yesterday with the Phillies, so we'll talk about that, but it'll be tied in with some mailbag questions. They've also optioned some players, which again will be tied in with some of these questions. So the first question comes from Chris, who asks, how many of the fringe players without options will make the team? Any trades that you see with the ones that don't make it, or do they just get DFA'd? So this is an important question if you're thinking about what is the roster going to look like for the Giants on opening day. And I want to reiterate something I have been saying over and over recently. Farhan Zaidi has said numerous times, or at least once, but emphatically, that the opening day roster is the most overhyped roster of all time because we spend so much time talking about it, and then it's going to change a lot throughout the course of a year. They're very active with their roster management. That being said, the opening day roster is significant for this team because of what you mentioned, out-of-options players, and that forcing the issue. Like, for example, last year they were able to just kind of send Mauricio Dubón down to the minors and never to be heard from again. This year they can't do that. Something has to give. They either have to have him on the roster, or they have to trade him, as you said, as a possibility, or DFA him. You can DFA a guy and then trade them within a week, but all of that is in play. The thing is, though, that rosters have expanded due to the shortened spring training because of the lockout and the delayed start and all that. So normally, I mean, we're at 26 as the normal roster size now. It was 25. Now it's 26 permanently. And they're expanding it all the way to 28 to start the season through April. So I believe that that means the Giants will carry their out-of-options fringe players, as you said. So the guys who this applies to, Dubón stands out to me as the main guy that this applies to. He hit a home run in the Cactus League game yesterday. I think it was against Patrick Sandoval, a left-handed pitcher, and I pointed out on Twitter, he's got solid career numbers against left-handed pitching, and so there's still a role for him to potentially carve out, but he's going to have to prove it, and I think he's going to get that opportunity, and it will allow them to just platoon their way through the month of April, in my opinion. Like, you can have Ruff in left, Dubón in center, and Slater in right, potentially some combination of those three against left-handed pitching, and not expose, for example, Mike Yastrzemski. I know that he probably wants to be an everyday player, but they're going to use their guys. If they're carrying Mauricio Dubón, they're going to use him. And you might be saying, well, Dubón should be playing in the infield and Ruff should be the DH. Well, that's also the beauty of this roster, is they can mix and match a lot. But I think that Thairo Estrada, who's also out of options, definitely makes this team. He, for me, is ahead of Dubón on the depth chart. I think that's pretty obvious, and they kind of fill similar roles, although Dubón can play center field. I'm not sure that that's really a skill set that they want Estrada to explore, although he has played some outfield. But I think they carry them both, and I think against lefties, you're going to see Estrada at second base. Belt could continue to start at first. I think he's a guy who maybe you use those days when there's a lefty starter as rest days for Belt, just to keep him off his feet. He is, getting up there in age, and they do believe in rest, and he hasn't even played in a spring game yet, but he's getting close apparently. But they could have Belt at first and then Wilmer Flores as the DH, or Flores could play first and then they could go with Ruff as the DH, and they could start Yastrzemski. So there's a lot of different iterations there, but the point is, I think Dubón sticks on the roster to start the year, and he's going to have to prove that he's worthy of that spot in the month of April. And if it's just not happening for him when rosters get trimmed down, I think that's when you could potentially see a move, whether it's a trade or a DFA. If he's really struggling, there's probably not going to be a ton of trade interest, but you could always, like I said, DFA a guy and then trade them. So I think those guys make it. Lamont Wade Jr. is out of options, but he's not getting DFA'd before the start of the season. No chance. Darren Ruff is out of options, but obviously, now he's got this multi-year deal. That's just set in stone. And other guys who are out of options, the interesting names, Tyler Beede. He and Dubón are like the fringe guys who are most helped by these expanded rosters. Even when rosters were supposed to be 26, normal 26-man rosters, I thought that they would both make it because of the fact that they were out of options. But I see them carrying Tyler Beede, unless he has just a disastrous spring and they really don't believe that he's going to be able to help them at all. Then he's a guy who there could be a move there. But they could also just hide him on the 28-man roster, let him play in games that are out of hand, 10-2 in the 6th inning, let him pitch a couple innings, let him finish out the game, or a spot start to kind of keep the starters fresh. That's all in play, but I think that he makes it. So I don't really have them making any difficult cuts. I see them being able to carry 28, and therefore, I see them being able to carry all their fringe guys who are out of options on that initial 28-man roster. It may have been different if it was 26, but with 28, the only other thing that could change is they could make a trade. There could still be a significant move left in them that could involve some of their out of options guys. And there could be a case to keep an Alex Blandino, and they would have to add him to a 40-man roster and DFA somebody. And then maybe you DFA an out of options guy, because that might make the most sense. So there's a lot still in play, and we're going to, talk about any kind of news that comes out with this. They did make a move, like I said yesterday, a minor trade. They sent Will Toffey to the Philadelphia Phillies for recently DFA'd outfielder. Well, I say outfielder. He played every position but pitcher and catcher last season for the Phillies. So utility man Luke Williams, right-handed player, and he's on the 40-man. The Phillies had DFA'd him to make room for Nick Castellanos, and the Giants pick him up and send Will Toffey, who wasn't on the 40-man. And so he's now there, and he's got 3 minor league options. So he's on the 40-man, but he'll be optioned. So, yeah. Anyway, coming up next, I want to talk about Lamont Way Jr. Is he going to be able to build off the season he had, or is he a guy who's a candidate to regress and come back down to earth in 2022? So stay tuned for that. But first, it's the time of year I've pretty much given up on all of my New Year's resolutions, but not this year, and we're almost in April. I'm sticking to my resolution to eat right thanks to Built Bar. It almost feels like it's not really a resolution because I actually enjoy eating them. Have you tried the Puffs yet? If you haven't, you're missing out on one of Built Bar's best tasting bars. Puffs are the first ever protein-infused marshmallow. They're fluffy, they're marshmallowy, they're not just a protein bar, they are a treat, and they're covered in 100% real chocolate. Go to Built.com, scroll down to their macros chart, and you'll be blown away. High protein, low calorie, high fiber, low carb. Most Built Bars contain just 130 calories, just 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, to go along with 17 grams of protein. Go to Built.com, use promo code LOCKED15, and get 15% off your order. Use promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. All right, as promised, we are going to continue going through your questions and tying it in with some news that's happened over the last few days, this minor trade and some options being exercised. So we'll get into all of that. Locked On MLB Prospects host Lindsey Crosby is a prospect encyclopedia, and he's going deep on the MLB stars of tomorrow. It's free and available wherever you get podcasts. Make it your second listen of the day. Thanks for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. So yeah, the next question comes from Say Hey Rob, who asks, thoughts on Lamont Wade Jr. building off of last year, or will he come back down to earth in 2022? So for me, what Lamont Wade Jr. was able to do last year looked sustainable. He had a 343 weighted on base average, the expected weighted on base average based on StatCast data, strikeout walk data, quality of contact, essentially. How did he actually hit the ball? What did he kind of deserve based on the contact that he made? Had him maybe even underperforming a little bit versus what StatCast expected. And so, you know, when I look at his platoon splits in his career, he's got 438 career plate appearances against righties, and there's nothing in there that screams to me that he shouldn't be able to continue to do what he's done, where he's been about 25% above league average production against right-handed pitching. 261 average, 344 on base, 391 slugging, 230 isolated power. The average on balls in play is just 290, which is very reasonable. You know, if you see a number like 400 here, you go, okay, well, that's bound to come down. And if he's only 25 percentage points above league average here, and you suppose a bunch of regression coming in average on balls in play, you're going to take a bunch off of the weighted runs created plus as well. And then you're like, okay, well, I'm not so sure that that's going to be repeatable. And then he's got very reasonable strikeout to walk ratio numbers against righties, just 20% strikeout rate and over a 10% walk rate. Those are both better than average numbers. And he's out of options. They're not going to be able to send him down. So, I mean, it is a possibility. He hasn't totally proven himself. He could struggle mightily this year, and there's nothing they can do. They can't send him down. And so it is something to watch, but I do believe there's no reason he shouldn't be able to kind of pick up where he left off. It did seem a little bit like they figured him out, the league, like high fastballs seemed to be a weakness of his, which is kind of status quo for launch angle guys who have a lot of power. Throw that fastball at the top of the zone. It's really hard to get on top of that pitch and drive it if you're able to execute. But, and this is a big but, not every pitcher can execute that. And if you make a mistake over the middle of the plate, he's going to punish you. That seems to be the type of hitter that he is. Against left-handed pitching, this is extreme small sample alert. 56 career plate appearances. He's got a 6 weighted runs created plus. That's one of the worst I've ever seen. But again, small sample. I would expect that to be maybe 60 at worst if he played a lot more against lefties. But we're talking about a 104 average, a 204 on base, and a 146 slugging in his brief major league career against left-handed pitching. This is where I talk about strikeout and walk numbers. Just a 5% walk rate, so that's half of his walk rate against righties, and a 30.4% strikeout rate, so 10 points higher than his strikeout rate against right-handed pitching. Those two numbers, like walk rate and strikeout rate, stabilize much more quickly than a lot of these other numbers. So when I look at that, I just see a guy who's uncomfortable in the batter's box to some degree, certainly more uncomfortable against lefties than he is against righties. So I think he's strictly a platoon player. He'll get his occasional chances to hit against left-handed pitching. Like, for example, last year he had 42 plate appearances against lefties. So he'll get those opportunities sometimes. They just come up. Maybe you're leading 7-0 in the 4th inning, and you're not just going to auto platoon that spot. You're going to give him his shot against lefties in those situations. And that's where you get an opportunity to prove that you can have better at-bats against same-handed pitching. But I generally think it won't probably go all that well based on the track record, and he'll just be a useful platoon player with power, who's going to start against right-handed pitching and slot in. He's one of those guys who can hit anywhere in the lineup. So yeah, I foresee him just having a similar type of year, maybe even playing a little more, because he didn't start the year on the major league team, if memory serves. So, he hit 18 home runs in 109 games, I would expect him to play more like maybe 120 games, have maybe 100 or so more plate appearances, and possibly make even more of an impact. So anyway, the next question comes from Breezy, who says, why aren't teams signing Michael Conforto? He's coming off one bad year in which the underlying metrics still looked good. He should be willing to accept a short prove-it deal. At this point, would you say the Giants are out on him given the Joc Pederson addition? So I have devoted entire episodes to this question, but I'm going to kind of repeat myself here. I don't really understand what's going on with Michael Conforto. I imagine it has something to do, I mean, obviously he's not getting the offers that he wants. What he wants is not clear. Like maybe he has no interest in a short prove-it deal, as you say, and maybe he just really wants to have this be his one opportunity to really cash in and maximize his return. But that may not be true, because at this point, clearly maybe that's not coming. And you're right. I mean, he was just barely above league average by weighted runs created plus, but the underlying numbers, like you're saying, with StatCast expected numbers, were well above average and right in line with his career numbers, which is about 25 percentage points above average. He is weaker against left-handed pitching, and maybe teams just feel like they're able to find this type of player in a Lamont Wade Jr., for example, or, you know, a Mike Yastrzemski. But I don't know. I mean, apparently he turned down over $100 million in an extension offer from the Mets last offseason. So that probably set the stage for him for wanting a big $100+ million offer. And, you know, according to ESPN, the predicted contract for Conforto was 3 years, $51 million. And if people are offering that or even less at this point, because we're getting close to opening day, he's going to miss time probably, unless he signs like right now and gets right into camp and gets going immediately. He's not even going to be ready for opening day, which is going to hurt his value even more, because teams are only going to pay for partial seasons if they know they're not going to get a full season out of him. He's got the qualifying offer attached to him, so it depends on your like financial status. The Giants, being a team that hasn't exceeded the luxury tax last year and is not a revenue sharing team, they would only surrender their second highest draft pick, which is going to be in the 60, 65 range. Some teams, luxury tax teams, I think they have to give up their second and their fifth highest draft pick. And then if you're a revenue sharing, the penalty is less. But it is something to keep in mind for the Giants. Like I said, they'd lose about the 65th overall pick in the draft. Their second round pick, which would be, you know, they pick at the very end of every round, given that they had the best record in the majors. And then, as I said on my other episode talking about Conforto, there's also a question about vaccination status, which does play a role potentially if he's looking at American League teams and specifically AL East teams, because unless you're vaccinated, you're not going to be able to go to Canada and play the Blue Jays. And that certainly could be hurting his market if he is not vaccinated. This is coming from some comments he made saying essentially that it was a personal choice and he wasn't going to talk about it, which, as we all know, is usually players, you generally don't say that unless you aren't vaccinated. I don't know. I don't pretend to know, and I don't really think it's any of my business for him. Whatever. The point is, he said during that comment, he said he had just had COVID. So I think it sounded more like he was saying he wasn't sure if he was going to get it because he had just had COVID. So I don't know, but at this point, I have no idea what's going to happen. Some are saying he could wait until after the draft when draft pick compensation would fall off of his free agency. But at that point, we're going to be in mid-July. The draft is later than it normally is. And so you're basically missing almost all of the season at that point, because he would need time to get ready as well. So I don't know. In terms of the Giants being out on him, I just kind of am thinking it's less likely than some other teams because they have a pretty full position player mix. Would he be an upgrade potentially over some of the guys? Certainly. But it just all depends on what he wants, and I have no idea what he wants at this point. I wouldn't get my hopes up, but it is something interesting to watch because he's definitely the best free agent still out there. So coming up next, I want to get to the question, should we be concerned about the lineup after not much additions during free agency? And also talk a little bit about some of the decisions the Giants have made in recent days regarding the roster, some options that may be surprising to some. But first, after months of playing, college basketball has determined the top teams for the Final Four and will determine this year's national champion this coming week. BetOnline.net is your #1 source for all your betting needs and sports info. From all the latest odds, contests, and player props, you name it. BetOnline remains the best spot for all your latest sports developments, including podcasts and reviews for all the leagues this season. It's not just basketball. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sporting wagering information needs, including live betting and your favorite casino games. A lot of baseball action there. Last year, Manager of the Year, we recommended, if you felt so inclined, to take a shot on Gabe Kapler winning Manager of the Year. I wish I had taken my own advice on that. I did not. But this year, I'm not going to make the same mistake. Over-unders, always underrate the Giants, so we'll get into that at some point in the coming days as well. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, it's where the game starts. All right, as promised, we're going to wrap it up talking about the lineup. Should we be concerned? And also I want to just tie in some loose ends about some moves that the Giants have made in recent days, including maybe just talking a little bit more about the trade for Luke Williams. So the question comes from Tom, who says, should we be concerned about the lineup after not much additions during free agency? I think a little bit. Definitely. I mean, they lose Posey. They lose Bryant. They lose Solano. I have said I think Estrada can kind of fill that Solano role just fine. I don't think that's quite as big of a loss as people think. Solano was a very useful role player, but he was mostly that. A role player mostly playing in the weak side of a platoon, meaning playing against left-handed pitching. And I think I've seen enough from Estrada to believe that he's going to potentially be able to have a nice year and fill that Donovan Solano role nicely, and maybe even be an upgrade in a lot of ways because he's more athletic, faster, more versatile, and the bat I think is the one question. But we've seen the upside. I mean, he's got power, he's got contact ability, so I'm pretty high on Thairo Estrada. Not saying he's going to be a superstar, but I think a useful role player, as was Donovan Solano. But going from Buster Posey, who was arguably the best catcher in baseball last year, and certainly over the span of his career, to me, easily the best catcher in the game and a Hall of Famer, to unproven players. Curt Casalli is a solid catcher in Major League Baseball, but he's not Buster Posey, certainly at the plate. And Joey Bart is completely unproven. So I have said numerous times, I think it's in play. They could still make a move at catcher. Wilson Contreras is probably available via trade. Sean Murphy on the A's is potentially available in a trade. And I'm not completely convinced still that they're just going to go into the season with Bart and Casalli. They could. Wouldn't be the worst plan in the world. But also for a contending team, I think that it's a big risk. And what happens if Joey Bart really struggles? What do you do at that point? Is Casalli like a #1 guy and they don't even have another catcher on the 40-man at this point? So that's something I'm completely watching here over the next week and a half or so as we move towards opening day. But it's no question a downgrade at the catcher position unless a miracle happens and Joey Bart plays at an elite level. It was always going to be a downgrade. As soon as Buster Posey left the team via retirement or whatever, it was always going to be tough to replace that. Chris Bryant didn't make that much of an impact for the Giants. I think he had like a 111 weighted runs created plus with San Francisco. He was a threat at the plate, and he was like an interesting name in the lineup, and he added depth to the lineup, certainly. But he didn't do all that much. I know he was good in the postseason, but we're talking about a 5-game sample, and I don't believe it's really that significant to say he was better in the playoffs. He was better in a 5-game sample. You can pick any 5-game stretch, and any player on your roster may be the best player during that 5-game stretch. It doesn't necessarily mean anything to me, even though you are facing the best pitching at that point. But look back to a 4-game series against the Dodgers at some point in the year and see who was the best performer during that series, it might be somebody else. So I don't really read too much into that. And I think Colorado is going to live to regret that contract. We'll see. I wish Bryant nothing but the best. He was a good Giant, good dude, but I don't know. I mean, yeah, you miss Chris Bryant in the lineup. You're a worse team without Posey and Bryant in the lineup. There's no question about it. But look at 2020. They were a good offensive team in 2020. They didn't have Bryant, they didn't have Posey, and they didn't have a lot of the guys they have now. And they were a good offensive team. So, you also add Joc Pederson, you have a designated hitter spot as they did in 2020. I think that they're worse than they were last year offensively. To me, there's no question, of course. But I still think they're going to be an above average offensive team, and they're going to platoon their way to scoring a bunch of runs and hitting a bunch of homers and being probably a top 10 offense overall. Maybe not top 5, top 3 like they basically were in 2021. So that's kind of my thoughts on that, but time will tell. And if they need to make an upgrade, I think that they're not going to be afraid to do it. And we saw a willingness to trade for a guy like Bryant mid-season when they felt like it was going to help their team. And I think that something like that would be on the table again if it looked like this team needed help at some specific position offensively. So, yeah, lastly, I mean, Elliot Ramos was optioned. I'm sure some fans were hoping that he might make the Major League team. That was never going to happen because he's got options. Some guys don't. There was just no way. But we probably will see Elliot Ramos at some point in 2022 as long as he produces in the minors. They also optioned Jalen Davis, who has one option remaining. So this is a make or break year for Jalen Davis. If he doesn't really play at the Major League level this year, I start to really question what his role is on this team moving forward. They also optioned Sean Jelly and reassigned Patrick Bailey and Ricardo Genoves, and they optioned Randy Rodriguez, Junior Marte, and Gregory Santos. So none of those guys are making the opening day roster, but they all stay in the system. Some of them on the 40-man, some of them not yet on the 40-man, like Bailey and Genoves. So anyway, that is all the time we have for today. Lot that we crammed in there. So coming up tomorrow, we'll talk about the latest with the Giants. We still have a bunch of mailbag questions we can get to as well as time permits throughout the week. We're just over a week away from opening day. I mean, like a week and a half. Today's game is televised. We'll talk about the starting pitching, which has been great in spring, and how I really think the Giants certainly have a top 10 rotation, and it's got the potential to be even more than that. So we'll talk about all that throughout the rest of the week. Thanks again for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. Now make your second listen Locked On MLB. Paul Francis Sullivan, but please call him Sully, brings you his unique perspective on the major leagues past and present. It's free and available wherever you get podcasts. Once again, my name is Ben Kaspick. Check me out on Twitter at Ben Kaspick, Kaspick. If you like this show, please consider rating it or leaving a review, liking, commenting, subscribing on YouTube, all of that good stuff. Thanks in advance, and thank you so much to everyone who's done so already. I can't wait to be with you again tomorrow. Thanks again for listening. Stay Locked On Giants.